Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are going to be doing my January end of month wrap up. So we are going to look at everything I read in the last 2 weeks of January. Now, I do have quite a bit to talk about, so we're just going to jump right in. But this is going to be a little bit different because normally I talk about the books that I read in chronological order of when I read them. But this time we are actually going to start with a lightning round of the short stories that I read because I did read 4 short stories from Seanan McGuire and there's just like not a ton that I can say about them. So we'll go through those really quick and then we will jump into everything else. So let's start with the first short story, and that is Threnody for Little Girl with Tuna at the End of the World. And so this is a science fiction short story, and the premise being that there are like no more tuna, maybe fish in general, but at least no more tuna, like wild tuna in the world until one day they find one. And our main character, as a little girl, wins like the lottery to be able to name this tuna. And then now we're seeing her as an adult and like kind of getting some of, what this event has meant to her. Now, I thought that it was an interesting world. It's an interesting story, but ultimately I didn't find it to be particularly satisfying. Like, I personally just needed a little bit more from the story for it to feel satisfying. So I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And then there was In Little Stars, again, also by Seanan McGuire. This is an October Day Universe short story, and it's following King Gilad, who is one of the characters that is mentioned in the main series. But this is before he's a king. And I really liked this. So we didn't have to set up a lot of the world because it's already been set up in the main series. There's not really a ton of reason to read this unless you have read the main series. So like we just didn't have to spend a ton of time on that kind of thing, which meant that we were really able to focus more in on this plot. And this plot is about a thing with King Gilad, which when I read the main story, I was just like, I really wonder how that came about. And now we're getting the story of how it came about. So I really loved this, and because it had a point, it felt full and complete, and I just generally enjoyed it. So I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then number 3 was The Levee Was Dry. And this is also a science fiction short story, but in this, it posits this world where once you turn 35, you can only hear recorded music that you've heard before you turned 35. And if you didn't listen to the recording before you turned 35, when you try to pardon me, when you try to listen to it after you turn 35, it just sounds like static, which is fascinating. People can still listen to live music, they just can't listen to recordings anymore. And I thought that this was a fascinating setup. I would love a full-length novel like exploring this world. I don't know that there's much like of a story there, but I just really want to explore this world so badly. Unfortunately, the plot really, this is very much a Seanan McGuire storyline. If you've read a lot of her works, then it's going to feel very familiar. I was able to guess where we were going to go, and I wasn't wrong on basically any of it. So like, it just was like kind of there. So I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And then the last short story that I read is In the Before When There Were Legends. And this is one that I really can't say almost anything about. It's definitely more of a folk tale kind of thing. But I did not like this. So the writing is very stylistic. It's definitely trying to feel like a folktale. Unfortunately, how it was written was very much, the style is just one where I get really, really lost in it. And so, this is a very short story, only between like 6 and 15 pages or something. And halfway through, I was so frustrated with it because I was struggling to understand these sentences. And then just generally the plot or storyline of this is not something that is I don't like it. It's just not what I want from a short story. And so between those two things, I just didn't really enjoy my time with this. However, I do recognize that it's not my cup of tea, but it is still a version of a short story that a lot of people do kind of like. And as such, I ended up giving this 2.5 stars. So those are the short stories that I read. So now we can go ahead and jump into everything else. Starting with Clean Sweep by Ilona Andrews, the first book in the Innkeeper Chronicles series. So in this book, we are following Dina, who is an innkeeper. Basically, she is in charge of an inn that serves as a way station for any alien who's kind of like passing through on their way to some other place in the galaxy. However, Earth still doesn't know that aliens exist, so Dina has to try to keep everything secret. And then when we open up on this book, it's very clear that something is going on in Dina's neighborhood. And it's also very clear to Dina that whatever being is kind of causing problems in the neighborhood is not an earthling. And so she has a choice to make of whether she should, you know, let it be and keep her neutrality intact, which is what an innkeeper is supposed to do, or whether she should actually take on this problem for herself but risk that neutrality and and her own personal safety. And the story goes from there. I actually like this. I really it's one of those things where it's very hard to judge this on the same scale as everything else, because this was written as a series of blog posts on the author's website. And as such, there was a lot of things where they couldn't go back and fix it. They couldn't really fix pacing issues or like add more details or better characterizations or anything like that. And so because of that, there is a lot of stuff where I'm like, it just needed to be a little tighter, and then I would have enjoyed it more, right? But keeping in mind that it started as a series of blog posts, I do think it is actually pretty well written. It's just, you can't really compare it if you compare it to like more traditionally published stuff, it's maybe not as strong. But I did find this world to be really interesting. I found the plot to be fairly interesting. I like Dina as a character, even though I found all of the characters to be a little bit campy and over the top. But the characters also, like the bare bones of the characterization is pretty good. I've read a lot from Ilona Andrews, so I do trust that they will even it out in the future books. So overall, I just thought that this was good fun, and I gave it a generous 4 stars. And then we come to Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. This is an adult science fiction standalone novella, and in it, our main character of Ariadne is part of this space crew that is on a mission to go explore 4 different exoplanets. Now, to do that, instead of building a habitat on the planet and then going and staying in the habitat, they actually are changing their bodies to match the environment of the planet they are going to be exploring next. Now, because this place is so far away from Earth, it takes them so long to get there and everything, Ariadne and the crew have to deal with their humanity and changing their body, as well as this growing distance from planet Earth. And the story goes from there. I have already done a full-length review for this, so I will leave it linked down below, but this is just generally a well-written novella that is something that I would not generally gravitate towards. So I loved this idea of like changing your body to match the environment, and I love the fact that these scientists are actually part of a citizens space group. I love the background on the citizens space group, and so those world building elements I thought were probably my favorite part of this novella. But like the characters are good. I mean, like, it was weird because there's 4 members of the crew and they all felt kind of like one character, the crew, because they just didn't really have a ton of individualization in the story. And then the development of each character and the crew itself is fairly subtle, whereas I would generally prefer much more overt and concrete kind of development. The plot itself is much more of a vehicle to ask these philosophical questions, which is fine. It's just not necessarily, again, it's not what I'm looking for from a story generally. There are some content warnings in this, specifically for suicidal thoughts as well as a suicide attempt. It is not particularly graphic, and it's couched in language where if you had to deal with this stuff, either in yourself or with others, you will absolutely recognize what's going on. But if you don't have that experience, it doesn't feel as concrete. So just a heads up going in. But I ended up giving this book 4 stars, primarily because of the quality of it, and even though my enjoyment of it was much closer to a 3.25 stars. And then I read If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy. This is the first book in the Meant to Be series, which is an adult contemporary romance series. This book is a loose retelling of Cinderella. We are following our main character of Cindy, who has just graduated from college and has moved back home when she gets roped into being a contestant on this bachelor-style show. Now, she doesn't really have any interest in finding love at this point, but being on a TV show in front of millions of people would offer her the opportunity to show off her shoe designs to many, many people. And so she decides to go ahead and go on this TV show, only to find out that the bachelor in question is actually somebody she had a meet cute with at the airport. And the story goes from there. This was an interesting book because I think a lot of the Cinderella retelling part and Cindy's exploration of self was pretty good, but the romance itself was not. So starting with the good, I loved the fact that this was a loose retelling of Cinderella. I think that the author did a really good job of putting in these moments so you can definitely tell that it's a Cinderella retelling without feeling beholden to every single plot point. Additionally, I like the fact that the stepfamily in this is actually very loving and supportive of Cindy. This is not something that I generally see in Cinderella retellings, and so it felt like a breath of fresh air. I thought that so Cindy is fat, and I thought the fat representation in this was great. There are some very specific things and situations that Cindy finds herself in on this reality TV show where they clearly intended for all of the contestants to be much skinnier. And so Cindy has to deal with this fact and assert herself. And I just generally really appreciate how she does that. And then Cindy herself is a fairly introspective character. I mean, she's at a crossroads in her life. She just graduated from college. She hasn't yet figured out what she's going to do next. She has a lot of things to work out. And so I did actually appreciate that in some ways, but I did feel like it detracted from the actual romance. And the romance itself, like I said, was not great. Partially, so mostly for me, it was because a lot of the interactions between our two characters, Cindy and then the bachelor, Henry, were on set. And so Cindy didn't really know how much of it was real and how much of it wasn't. And so she wasn't fully invested in this relationship. And so I wasn't fully invested in the relationship. Now, obviously, it's a romance. We know they're going to get together. Even knowing that, though, I always just held back a little bit because we just didn't know. Additionally, our Henry is just kind of bland. He's just kind of there. He didn't really have interests or hobbies. I really didn't understand why Cindy really liked him other than he was really into her, which is not a great reason. The big, third act problem that happens was something that was a little frustrating because I could kind of see what the problem was and why they were acting the way they were. But I was just like, okay, so you can't use the words you want to, but you can use other words. Like, you're looking at it black and white, and there's actually a lot of gray here. Just be upfront and honest, and it would be fine. Ugh. And then the like ending where they kind of come back together, it was so lackluster. I was just like so frustrated at that point. I just didn't care, honestly. So yeah, this was a little strange because I really liked some of the stuff, but all of the romance stuff just didn't work for me. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. And then I finished The Sword of Summer by Rick Riordan. This is the first book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series, which is a young adult fantasy series where we're following our main character of Magnus Chase. Now, Magnus is homeless and has been for the last 2 years since his mom was killed. He has been trying really hard to stay off the radar of his family, his uncles, because his mom warned him against like going to his uncles, until one day his uncles are out in the city actively trying to hunt him down to try to bring him in to the family business, which happens to deal very heavily with the Norse mythology. And so our story kind of goes from there. Now, was interesting. I think the mythology of this was good. Now, like, this is like Magnus is like, it's presuming that the Norse mythology is like real, and so Valhalla is a real place. And you know, the Tree of Life, I don't remember the name. It's like escaping me right now. But the Tree of Life is real, is a place that you can go, you can climb that tree kind of thing. But the mythology was really good. And I like that it was basic level because Magnus didn't grow up knowing all of this. And so a lot of times it has to be explained to him. I did find that I had a bit of familiarity with Norse mythology going into this, and that definitely helped because then it meant that these new vocabulary words were at least somewhat familiar. But if it's not familiar to you, like there is a glossary at the back of the book with a pronunciation guide. So I found that to be really helpful as well. I think that Magnus as a character is well written. He's not my kind of character, I will say that, but I do think that he was pretty well written. I enjoyed the side characters and I loved watching them come together more as like a kind of a found family. It was just really fun. And especially I loved the character backstories and like how they came to this specific place in the present day. I found that to be really fun as well. The end goal of this plot is actually fairly straightforward, but the plot is adventurous and I wasn't really quite sure how we'd get there, and that was fun to follow as well. And I will say there is no romance in this book, which was a very pleasant surprise. There's no romance. There's not even a setup for a romance. I was so happy to see that. So overall, I think that this is a pretty well written book. I understand why a lot of people like it. It's not my kind of book and I didn't really connect with it, but I still did enjoy my time with it and I don't regret reading it. But I ended up giving The Sword of Summer 3.5 stars. And then lastly, we have Wild Card by Marie Lu. And so this is the second book in the Warcross duology, which is a young adult science fiction duology that follows our main character of Emika Chen, who is like a very, very good hacker. And in the first book, she accidentally glitches herself into this virtual reality international like opening game kind of thing everybody's watching, and she ends up getting hired by the owner of the virtual reality game to actually track down somebody else who has also been hacking into the virtual reality. And then in this book specifically, Emika is determined to stop a person who has been doing some tyranny-like things. I like trying to come up with a description of this book has been very, very difficult because I don't want to spoil anything. But that's basically what is going on in this second book. I DNF'd this at page 96. So I liked the first one because it was fun. I liked our main character of Emika. I liked, being in this virtual reality. I could definitely see the problems with it, but I liked it. And so it was fun. Like, it was fun enough to make up for all the problems. Unfortunately, with this book, Emika feels like a completely different character. Like, when we first meet her, I would understand that she would be paranoid and even a little panicky, but how it's written is in complete contrast to how she was written in the first book. It didn't feel like the Emika we knew from the first book being paranoid. It just felt strange, honestly. And it was just like some other person kind of being paranoid and panicky. So I did not appreciate that. And we didn't get much in the virtual reality in the same way. And from what I understand, we're not going to for most of the rest of the book. And so without those fun parts, it is so much more obvious what the problems are. They're just glaring. And so I just wasn't having fun with it. So I decided to go ahead and DNF it. So that is it. That is everything that I read in the last 2 weeks of January. So for my point totals for my goals, so Threnody for Little Girl with Tuna at the End of the World, the first short story that I read, that gave me 1 point. In Little Stars gave me 2 points. The Levy Was Dry also gave me 2 points. This In the Before When There Were Legends also gave me 2 points. Clean Sweep gave me 3 points because this was actually the second book on my Goodreads TBR shelf when I picked it up. To Be Taught If Fortunate gave me 1 point. If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy, that gave me 2 points because it's a romance. The Sword of Summer gave me 1 point, and I also gave myself 1 point for Wildcard because I did make it to page 96, which is a good chunk of book. So that means that I got a total of 15 points for the last 2 weeks, which means for January, I received a total of 29 points, which is way more than I needed. My goal is 100 for the first 6 months. That means I only needed to get between 16 and 17 points. So I am rocking it so far. And I'm really happy to have that cushion just in case things kind of go awry in the next couple of months. But that is it. If you have any thoughts or feelings about anything that I have talked about in this video, please leave me a comment down below. You can also let me know what you're reading. I would love to hear it. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.